In November of 2023, my dad purchased this 1981 Ford Mustang in Northern California, and despite being a running and driving car, it needed a lot of work to look its best again. In today's episode of Angel's Garage, me and my dad tear this Mustang down to a bare shell and discover a lot of, mostly unpleasant, surprises along the way. Let's go! After buying the Mustang and driving it home, me and my dad knew there was a lot of problems with it that would need to be taken care of. So much so that I was able to make a whole video roasting the car and its problems. Most of these issues though were just on the surface level, so just before tearing into the car, we did a thorough inspection to see if there's any other major problems we needed to know about. The first thing we noticed was that the driver's side fender had been replaced with an aftermarket one. This wasn't a huge problem, but what was a huge problem was the damage behind it. The section of firewall behind the fender was banged up and smashed in pretty bad. That and the replacement fender showed that this car had been in quite a nasty accident at some point. Just behind the damaged firewall, we found our next problem. The driver's side door was pretty loose, and after taking a look at the hinge, it was, well, it was pretty bad. The door hinge had seen a lot of use over its life and would need to be rebuilt. Our inspection then moved underneath the car, and from there, things only got worse. The first thing that became apparent was some extensive cracks underneath the driver's seat. As it turns out, the worn-out seat was the least of my concerns while driving the car, as I wasn't far from just having the seat dragging on the highway. Moving on, the underside of the engine and transmission was looking nice and oily. And finally, the last problem we found was a large hole drilled into the bottom of the muffler. This wasn't a problem because the exhaust system was going to be replaced anyway, but I think this demonstrates perfectly what kind of life this car had before we got it. After looking things over, we came to the conclusion that this car needed a lot more help than we originally anticipated. The original goal was to tear apart the car so it could be painted, but the goal shifted now to tearing apart the car so we could fix all the body damage and make this car strong and reliable again. And with this new goal in mind, we began the disassembly. Starting out on the inside of the car, the first items to come out was the old Recaro bucket seats and the bottom of the rear bench seat. Below the seats was years of loose change and trash. Oh, and don't forget about the aftermarket speaker wire. Afterwards, the rest of the back seat and the carpet was pulled out. With the carpet out of the way, we finally got a good look at the cracks underneath the driver's seat, and it didn't look any better from the top side. We also saw some surface rust on the passenger floor pan, but overall, the passenger side was in good shape. Back on the driver's side, we found some more damage that would need to be taken care of. On the transmission tunnel, right next to the footwell, the steel had been beaten out of place, and there was now a hole where the spot welds broke. This is one of those things that just leaves you with more questions than answers. Ignoring the damaged transmission tunnel for now, I decided to go ahead and fix the floor pan because it was driving me kind of crazy. I first ground down the cracks to bare steel, then using a drill, I drilled some holes at the ends of the cracks to keep them from spreading. Finally, I set the pan back in place using a floor jack and welded it together. Overall, the repair came out pretty good, and with the pan back together in one piece, we were able to test fit some new seats into the car. Parts were expensive and hard to find for the original Recaro seats, so my dad decided to go with these new black leather seats, which looked great in the car. Moving away from the inside of the car, we decided to go ahead and start working on removing the engine and transmission. One thing was for sure, this engine bay was absolutely stuffed full. The main reason my dad wanted this car in particular was its straight-six engine, and with that in mind, we were going to remove as much as we can from this engine to make it stand out and be a showpiece. First out was the smog pump, which quickly found a new home. Next out was a very oversized battery, and following that was the air cleaner, which revealed more hoses and vacuum lines cluttering up this engine bay. It was now time for some of the messier work, which was removing the cooling system. This started with draining the radiator, which had some of the best looking coolant I've ever seen. After getting rid of this coolant that looked like it was old enough to vote, it was time to remove the hoses. First was the upper radiator hose, followed by the lower radiator hose, which were both noted to be very soft. Then it was time to pull out the heater core hoses. One of the heater core hoses had a huge vacuum tree system attached to it, which I can only imagine was used to warm up the air in a vacuum system for some reason. I don't know. Either way, this vacuum tree would be joining a smog pump in the trash. With the hoses out of the way, the radiator came out next, which was actually in pretty good shape. Finally, the fan came out, which concluded the cooling system. Moving straight into the AC system, my dad broke the two AC lines on top of the compressor loose, and then broke loose the two lines going to the evaporator. The condenser then came out next, and unlike the radiator, this was not in good shape. No wonder this thing didn't have working AC. The last piece of the AC system to come out would be the compressor. This involved loosening the alternator so the belts could be removed, then removing several bolts, securing down the compressor. After removing all the bolts, this 1960s looking compressor was unable to be pulled from the car. With the compressor removed, one last heater hose right behind it was finally able to be pulled from the car, and the fluid left in this hose looked spectacular. And just as a reminder, this is what coolant is supposed to look like. Now that the AC system was gone, we could see more of the exhaust system, and oh boy was this something. I don't know what was better, the exhaust pipe that looked like a coffee can, the EGR hose wrapped around in a loop, or the starter motor that was completely locked in behind both of these pipes. Seeing all of this reminded me why lots of mechanics despise engineers. Since the alternator was already loose, it made sense to go ahead and remove it. Under the watchful eye of our cat, the remaining bolts for the alternator were removed and the alternator was pulled out. The final bit to come out would be the bracket that held the alternator and the AC compressor. The last major system that would need to be disconnected from the engine would be the power steering. First was the simple job of removing the power steering lines, which went terrible. Whoever installed these power steering lines did so with the strength of a gorilla, because these lines were not budging. After rounding out the fitting with the wrench, a pair of vice grips had to be used to break the lines loose. Once the lines were disconnected, The belt for the power steering pump was removed, and the power steering pump was unbolted and pulled out from the engine bay. With all the big stuff out of the way, the last few items to disconnect was the fuel hose, the throttle cable, and the wire harness. And with the engine now ready to pull, it was time to jack up the car and work on disconnecting the transmission and drive shaft. This would start with removing the drive shaft, which is only held down with 4 bolts, making it super fast and easy to remove. Or not. Looks like the same person who tightened down the power steering lines also channeled every bit of their strength to tighten down the drive shaft bolts, because they were stupid tight. Not that they shouldn't be tight, but this shouldn't happen when you try to remove a bolt.
I broke it, didn't I?
After sacrificing a wrench that up to this point had handled various other drive shafts with no problems, we moved on to a 3/8 drive socket and breaker bar, which, while this tool thankfully held up, it didn't make the job of removing these bolts any easier.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, got that one.
Thank goodness.
Broke.
With the bolts finally out, the drive shaft was able to slide out from the transmission and be removed from the car. Next up was preparing the transmission to come out. Going to the inside of the car, we will remove the shifting knob, the upper boot, disconnect the lower boot, and then disconnect the 3 bolts holding down the shifter arm. Moving back underneath the car, the shifting cable had to be disconnected from the clutch fork. This involved pulling the plastic cover off, disconnecting the retaining clip, and then levering a screwdriver against the clutch fork to pop the cable out. The last item that needed to come off the transmission was the speedometer cable. After having difficulties popping the cable out, we decided to work on it later. And by work on it later, I mean forget about it until the engine and transmission were halfway out of the car. The transmission mount was undone, followed by the exhaust pipe, finishing off the work underneath the car. While cleaning up, my dad noticed something quite comical on the bottom of the front bumper. Turns out, through the power of a stick and click, this car actually had underglow at one point. And after that fine discovery, the car was lowered to the ground and the engine hoist was hooked up to the engine. Following that, the engine mounts were disconnected.
Oh boy. Ooh.
We then began the process of jacking the engine and transmission out of the car. This process went relatively pain-free, until the speedometer cable reminded us it hadn't been pulled out yet. Once the speedometer cable was disconnected, the engine and transmission came out without any more issues and were safely lowered to the ground. The transmission was then disconnected from the engine, and the engine was mounted onto an engine stand where it would await its rebuild. At this point, there really wasn't too much left to remove from this car. Starting on the body, the hood came off first. Right after that, the front bumper cover and bumper came off, which was shortly followed by the fenders. With the fenders off, we moved back and pulled off the doors, which went quick. The last piece to come off would be the trunk lid. I will say one thing, this trunk lid is heavier than it looks. After pulling off the driver's side fender, we could finally see all the damage that was located behind the fender. Not only was the firewall smashed in, but the A-pillar was also bent inwards, and an upper section of frame was smashed in. My dad attempted to straighten out the upper frame piece, but it was hardly budging. It was at this point that we decided that the best way to repair these pieces was to cut out all the damaged steel and weld in some patch panels, something we would tackle in a later video. Going back inside the car, the plastic quarter panel pieces were pulled out along with a majority of the wire harness for the rear of the car. The taillights were then removed, and the last major piece to remove now would be the dashboard. The dashboard, along with all the HVAC components, wasn't hard to pull. However, all the old plastic on the dashboard was very brittle after spending a majority of its life in a relatively dry area, leading to many cracks forming when it was pulled. Lastly, the steering column was removed, finishing off the inside of the car. The car was now down to having its brake and suspension system removed. One nice thing about these Foxbodies is that the front suspension can be removed all as one unit by dropping the K-member. After we got the K-member out from underneath the car, two things became quickly apparent. One was that the engine bay looked quite barren now, and two, that this suspension system was worn out. The struts were shot and the ball joints were feeling really loose. It's actually amazing, all things considered, how the car handled as good as it did when we are driving it around. The very last items to come out was the glass. Using a heat gun and some wire, we worked the windshield and quarter windows out of place. Then finally, we are down to the sunroof, which was in terrible condition. Underneath all the silicone sealant was several large rust holes in the roof itself, which was quite amazing considering this was a rust-free California car. Again, just like the damaged steel on the front of the car, this will require a lot of welding to fix. The rear axle would come out later as we still needed to move the car around a little bit, but otherwise, this car was now down to a bare shell. Given all the body work this car needed, we couldn't help ourselves from getting started on some of it, namely the large dent in the driver's side quarter panel. Using a hammer and punch, my dad began beating the damaged steel and body filler back out. This led to a bunch of body filler breaking off the car, and eventually, the quarter panel popped back into shape. Or more into shape. This area would still need a lot of help in the future. The last job we wanted to tackle now was removing all the old paint and taking the car down to bare steel. Paint removal began with some aircraft stripper, which went to town on the old paint. My dad abraded the paint just prior to applying the stripper, which helped it work faster and more effectively. Once the aircraft stripper did its job, the leftover paint on the roof and quarter panels was removed with some Roloc surface conditioning disc. The rest of the paint inside the car, door jambs, and engine bay was removed using a media blaster. The media blaster worked great at removing all the rust and getting into all the nooks and crannies. And before we knew it, the Mustang was down to bare steel and was ready to begin receiving some serious body work. One thing is for sure about these Foxbodies, they are pretty simple cars and come apart really fast. Well, that's it for today's episode. In the next few episodes of this Mustang series, we'll go over the rebuild of the engine, bodywork, and painting the car. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.